The morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Sarah Mitchell checked her watch one more time. It was 7:45 a.m., and her flight was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. She was early, just as she always liked to be. At 35 years old, Sarah had worked incredibly hard to reach her position as the Vice President of Technology at Global Tech Solutions, one of the biggest software companies in Atlanta. Today was supposed to be like any other business travel day. She had made this same trip many times before, flying to California for important meetings with clients and partners. The private jet was a necessity due to her tight schedule and the company's need for flexibility. Sarah had earned this privilege through years of dedication and exceptional results in her field. As she walked through the parking lot, her heels clicked softly against the pavement. She wore a navy blue designer suit that she had carefully chosen the night before, her dark hair styled neatly in a professional bun. Her Louis Vuitton briefcase contained her laptop and the presentations she had spent weeks preparing for the upcoming meeting with Silicon Valley investors. The morning air was crisp, and Sarah took a deep breath, mentally reviewing her presentation points. She had always been known for her preparation and attention to detail. That's what had helped her climb the corporate ladder despite the many obstacles she had faced as a black woman in the tech industry. Other travelers were arriving at the terminal, too. A few business executives in suits hurried past her, engaged in their phone conversations. Sarah noticed how they breezed through the entrance, barely catching the attention of the security staff. She had seen this pattern before, but had learned to stay focused on her own path. The glass doors of the terminal slid open smoothly as she approached. The interior was elegant and minimalist, with comfortable leather seats and large windows overlooking the runway where several private jets sat gleaming in the morning light. Sarah could see her company's chartered jet being prepared for takeoff, the ground crew moving efficiently around it. At the check-in counter, Sarah retrieved her documentation, her government ID, company credentials, and flight manifest, all organized neatly in a leather travel wallet. She had done this routine dozens of times before, and everything was always in perfect order. Her executive assistant had double-checked all the arrangements yesterday, as usual. The terminal was relatively quiet, with only the soft hum of conversation and the occasional announcement over the speakers. A few other passengers sat in the waiting area, some working on laptops, others reading newspapers. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the exclusive lounge area, where a barista was preparing drinks for early morning travelers. Sarah approached the security checkpoint with the same confidence she brought to her boardroom presentations. Her stride was purposeful, her expression professional and pleasant. She had earned her place in these exclusive spaces, and her track record spoke for itself. Over the years, she had broken numerous barriers in her industry, becoming one of the youngest VPs in her company's history. The security guard station was staffed by a middle-aged man she hadn't seen before. His name tag read Richard Barnes, and he sat straight up in his chair as she approached. Sarah noticed immediately how his expression changed when he saw her, but she maintained her professional demeanor. She had learned long ago that success often meant staying composed in uncomfortable situations. Little did Sarah know that this routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary. As she prepared to present her credentials to Barnes, she couldn't have anticipated how the next few minutes would not only test her composure, but also spark a national conversation about racism in private aviation. The events that were about to unfold would demonstrate her extraordinary grace under pressure and ultimately lead to significant changes in the industry. Sarah stepped forward, placing her documents on the security desk with a polite smile, just as she had done countless times before. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon make headlines across the country. Richard Barnes stared at Sarah's documents with an intensity that seemed unnecessary. His eyes moved slowly between her ID photo and her face, his frown deepening with each passing second. The other travelers around them continued their morning routines, unaware of the tension building at the security desk. "There must be some mistake here," Barnes said, his voice carrying a tone that Sarah had heard too many times before. "This private flight is for Global Tech's vice president." He emphasized the title as if it couldn't possibly belong to the woman standing in front of him. Sarah maintained her professional smile, though she felt her heart beating faster. "Yes, that's correct. I'm Sarah Mitchell, Vice President of Technology at Global Tech Solutions." She pulled out her business card and company ID badge, adding them to the documents already on the desk. Barnes barely glanced at the additional identification. Instead, he looked past Sarah, as if expecting someone else to show up. "Maybe you're the assistant," he suggested, his voice dripping with condescension. "The actual VP must be running late." The nearby conversations began to quiet as people noticed the exchange. Two white executives who had passed through security just minutes earlier stopped their discussion to watch. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her focus on Barnes. "No, sir," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady and clear. "I am the vice president, and these are my credentials. As you can see, everything is in order for my 8:30 flight." She pointed to the flight manifest, where her name was clearly listed as the primary passenger. Barnes leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, I've worked here for 15 years. I know what executives look like coming through here." His implication hung heavy in the air. "Maybe there's been a booking error. Let me call my supervisor to sort this out." Sarah checked her watch. 8:10 a.m. The meeting in California was crucial, and she couldn't afford any delays. "Sir," she said, her tone remaining professional but firm, "I've flown from this terminal numerous times. If you check your records, you'll find my previous flight history." But Barnes was already shaking his head. "Anyone can say that. For security reasons, I need to verify your identity." He began typing slowly on his computer, deliberately taking his time. "It's protocol, you understand. We can't just let anyone through claiming to be an executive." The unfairness of the situation was becoming more apparent to everyone watching. A young white woman breezed through the checkpoint next to them, Barnes barely glancing at her documents before waving her through with a friendly smile. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering the advice her mother had given her years ago. Sometimes, staying calm is your strongest weapon. She reached for her phone, her movements deliberate and measured. "I understand the need for security," she said, opening her email. "I have additional verification here. Emails from our travel department, calendar invites for today's investor meeting, and correspondence with the jet company." She turned the phone screen toward Barnes, but he waved it away. "Those could be fake," he said dismissively. "Besides, how do I know that's even your phone?" The absurdity of his statement hung in the air. Sarah noticed one of the white executives who had been watching shake his head in disbelief. A few other passengers had stopped pretending not to notice and were openly staring now. Sarah straightened her spine, standing at her full height. She had faced discrimination before, but usually it was more subtle, hidden behind polite smiles and vague excuses. This blatant display was different, and she knew that how she handled the next few moments would be crucial. With steady hands, she began recording the interaction on her phone. "Mr. Barnes," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the now quiet terminal, "I'd like to document that I provided multiple forms of identification, all of which confirm I am Sarah Mitchell, Vice President of Technology at Global Tech Solutions, and the authorized passenger for this flight. Could you please explain exactly why you're refusing to accept these documents?" The security guard's face reddened, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The terminal supervisor had arrived, drawn by the unusual silence in normally bustling terminal. The terminal supervisor, Mrs. Janet Cooper, was a tall woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that quickly assessed the situation. She had worked at the private aviation terminal for over 2 decades and recognized Sarah immediately from her previous flights. "Sarah, good morning," Mrs. Cooper said warmly, then turned to Barnes with a questioning look. "Richard, why is our regular client being delayed?" Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't back down. "Ma'am, I'm just following security protocols. The documentation seems irregular." He emphasized the last word while avoiding eye contact with both women. Mrs. Cooper's expression hardened. "Irregular? I personally checked Ms. Mitchell through security at least a dozen times this year alone." She reached for the documents on the desk, but Barnes pulled them back. "With all due respect, Mrs. Cooper," he said, his voice taking on a defensive tone, "we've had issues with identity theft recently. I'm just being thorough." He glanced at Sarah with barely concealed suspicion. Anyone could get fake business cards printed. The growing crowd of onlookers now included flight crew members and other security personnel. Among them was Mark Davidson, a pilot who had flown Sarah on several previous trips. He stepped forward, his uniform crisp and his face showing clear concern. "That's enough, Barnes," Mark said firmly. "I can vouch for Ms. Mitchell. She's one of our most respected passengers." He turned to Sarah with an apologetic look. "I'm scheduled to fly you to California today, ma'am." But Barnes wasn't finished. His face reddened further as he stood up from his desk, puffing out his chest. "It's not about who knows who. It's about proper security measures. How do we know she didn't just get lucky with a few flights? Maybe someone on the inside is helping her sneak through." Sarah's phone continued recording as the situation spiraled. Several passengers had their phones out now too, capturing the increasingly tense scene. The terminal's usual quiet atmosphere had been replaced by whispers and the occasional gasp at Barnes's implications. Mrs. Cooper stepped closer to Barnes's desk, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Richard Barnes, are you suggesting that I, the terminal supervisor, am involved in some sort of security breach?" Her eyes narrowed. "Or are you implying something else about Ms. Mitchell's right to be here?" The air in the terminal grew thick with tension. Sarah remained still, her expression composed despite the chaos unfolding around her. She had become the center of attention, but not for her usual presentations or business achievements. This time, it was for simply trying to board her scheduled flight. A young black woman in the crowd, probably in her early 20s, was wiping tears from her eyes as she watched. Sarah caught her gaze and gave her a small, reassuring nod. This moment wasn't just about catching a flight anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of discrimination that happened every day, usually without witnesses or recordings. Barnes began shuffling papers on his desk, his movements growing more agitated. "I'm just doing my job," he insisted, his voice rising. "If you're all going to gang up on me for following procedures, maybe we need to call the police to sort this out." The mention of police caused a ripple of reactions through the crowd. Mrs. Cooper's face went pale, and Mark the pilot stepped forward again, placing himself slightly between Barnes and Sarah. But Sarah herself remained unmoved, her phone steady in her hand. "Mr. Barnes," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the terminal, "I want to make sure I understand correctly. Are you threatening to call the police because I, a documented passenger with multiple forms of identification and several witnesses who can verify my identity, am attempting to board my scheduled flight?" The question hung in the air like a spotlight, illuminating the absurdity of the situation. Barnes's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. In the heavy silence that followed, the sound of approaching footsteps drew everyone's attention to the terminal entrance, where two more figures were about to join the unfolding drama. The two figures walking through the terminal entrance were James Wilson, CEO of Global Tech Solutions, and his chief of security, David Martinez. They had arrived for their own flight to New York, but immediately noticed the unusual crowd gathered at the security checkpoint. James, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair, quickened his pace when he recognized Sarah. His face darkened as he took in the scene, his vice president of technology standing calmly with her phone recording while a security guard appeared to be blocking her path. "Sarah?" James called out, his authoritative voice causing heads to turn. "What's going on here?" Before anyone could answer, Barnes straightened up and smiled broadly at James. "Good morning, sir. Just a routine security check. We'll have you through in no time." His entire demeanor had changed, becoming almost cheerful as he reached for James's documents. "I'm not concerned about my documents right now," James said firmly. "I'm asking why my VP of Technology is still standing here at 8:20 when she has an 8:30 flight to California for our most important investor meeting of the quarter." Barnes's smile faltered. He looked between James and Sarah, the realization slowly dawning on his face. David Martinez, the chief of security, stepped forward, his trained eye taking in every detail of the situation. "Mr. Barnes," Martinez said, reading the guard's name tag, "I understand following security protocols, but I'm curious why you're questioning the identity of an executive who flies through here regularly." His tone was professional but carried an edge of steel. Mrs. Cooper quickly filled them in on the situation. As she spoke, the young black woman who had been watching earlier stepped forward bravely. "I recorded everything," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The way he treated her. It wasn't right. He let others through without even looking at their IDs properly." Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Sarah finally lowered her phone but kept the recording running. "James, David, I appreciate you being here, but I can handle this." She turned to Barnes, who was now visibly sweating. "Mr. Barnes, I want to be very clear about what has happened here today." The terminal fell silent as Sarah spoke, her voice steady and clear. "You've questioned my identity despite multiple forms of verification. You've implied that I'm committing fraud. You've threatened to call the police, and you've done all this while allowing other passengers to pass through with minimal scrutiny." David Martinez pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Security team to the main checkpoint, please. We need a replacement officer immediately." He turned to Barnes. "Sir, please step away from the desk." Barnes began to protest, but James cut him off. "Mr. Barnes, I've been CEO of Globaltech for 15 years. Sarah Mitchell is not only our VP of Technology, but also the architect of our most successful software platform. She's been featured in Business Weekly and has given keynote speeches at major tech conferences." James's voice grew harder, but even if she wasn't any of those things, even if this was her first flight, she deserved the same respect and professionalism you showed me when I walked in. Your behavior today has been absolutely unacceptable." 2 security officers arrived and took positions near Barnes. Mrs. Cooper stepped forward with a set of forms. "Richard Barnes, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Please surrender your security badge." As Barnes reluctantly removed his badge, Sarah checked her watch again. 8:25. She turned to the pilot, Mark. "Can we still make the flight?" Mark nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. We'll expedite the departure procedures." Mrs. Cooper personally began processing Sarah's security check. As she did, the young woman who had recorded everything approached Sarah hesitantly. "Ms. Mitchell," she said softly, "I'm an IT student. What you did today, how you handled this, thank you. You showed me what real leadership looks like." Sarah gave her a warm smile. "What's your name?" "Jessica Thompson." "Well, Jessica," Sarah said, pulling out a business card, "when you finish your degree, send me your resume. We need more strong women in tech who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right." As Sarah's private jet took off into the clear morning sky, the events at the terminal were already spreading across social media like wildfire. Jessica Thompson's video, along with recordings from other witnesses, had been shared thousands of times within the first hour. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack was trending, and Sarah's phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. In the luxurious cabin of the jet, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment to process what had happened. Mark, the pilot, had made sure she had a cup of her favorite green tea waiting for her on board. As she sipped it, she opened her laptop to find hundreds of email notifications and messages of support flooding in. "Ms. Mitchell," the flight attendant, Lisa, said gently, "CNN and MSNBC are already running the story. They're requesting interviews when you land." She paused, then added more personally, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I've worked these private flights for 6 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, remembering Jessica's tears and grateful expression. The young IT student's reaction had reminded her of her own early days in the tech industry, when she had often been the only black woman in the room. She opened her email and began crafting a careful message to her team at Globaltech. Back at the terminal, things were far from quiet. Mrs. Cooper was in an emergency meeting with the aviation company's board of directors, who had been immediately notified of the incident. The company's reputation was on the line, and they knew it. David Martinez, Globaltech's chief of security, had stayed behind to ensure everything was properly documented. He interviewed witnesses, collected security camera footage, and took detailed statements. His military background and security expertise told him this would become a landmark case for aviation security protocols. "The issue isn't just Barnes," he explained to Mrs. Cooper during a brief break. "It's about systemic problems in security screening. We need to look at the entire process, the training, the oversight, everything." Meanwhile, James Wilson was making calls from his own delayed flight to New York. The CEO had already arranged for Globaltech's legal team to prepare a formal complaint, not just about Barnes but about the broader issues of discrimination in private aviation. Jessica Thompson, still at the terminal finishing paperwork about her witness statement, found herself surrounded by reporters who had begun arriving. She clutched Sarah's business card like a talisman, remembering the VP's composed dignity throughout the ordeal. It was like watching a masterclass in leadership. Jessica told a reporter from the local news, Miss Mitchell never lost her cool, never lowered herself to his level. She just stood her ground and let the truth speak for itself. The aviation company's PR team was in crisis mode. They had already drafted an official apology statement, but they knew it wouldn't be enough. Mrs. Cooper insisted on being part of their emergency response team, bringing her 20 years of experience to the table. We need more than just sensitivity training, she argued in the boardroom. We need a complete overhaul of our security screening procedures, and we need to hire more diverse staff at all levels. On social media, other successful black professionals began sharing their own stories of discrimination in aviation, both private and commercial. What had started as one incident was quickly becoming a movement for change in the industry. At 30,000 feet, Sarah finished her email to her team and began preparing for her investor meeting. She had added a new slide to her presentation, one about corporate responsibility and the importance of diversity in leadership. The morning's events had only strengthened her resolve to make a difference. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you again for today. I've already started updating my resume." Sarah smiled, remembering her own mentors who had helped her navigate difficult times in her career. As the jet cruised westward, Sarah opened her notes app and began writing. She knew that once the investor meeting was done, she would need to make some important decisions about how to use this incident to create lasting change. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments could become the most powerful catalysts for progress. 2 days after the incident, Sarah sat in her San Francisco hotel room, watching herself on the morning news. The investor meeting had been a success, but now she faced a different kind of challenge. Her phone interview with a major news network was playing across the country. "I didn't want to become the face of this issue," Sarah's voice came through clear and measured on the screen. "But since it happened, I have a responsibility to use this moment to create real change." The story had exploded beyond anything anyone expected. Jessica Thompson's video had reached over 10 million views. Other videos from the terminal showed different angles of the confrontation, and each new perspective added to the public's understanding of what discrimination looked like in real time. Sarah's inbox was filled with thousands of messages. Some were from black executives sharing similar stories. Others were from companies wanting her to speak about leadership and dignity under pressure. But the ones that touched her most were from young black women in tech, seeing in her story a reflection of their own struggles and hopes. Back in Atlanta, the private aviation company was facing a crisis. Their stock had dropped 15% in 2 days. Major clients were demanding answers about their security protocols. Mrs. Cooper had been promoted to head of security operations, with a mandate to completely overhaul their training and hiring practices. Richard Barnes had been officially fired, but that was just the beginning. The company announced a comprehensive review of all security incidents from the past 5 years, looking for patterns of discriminatory behavior. They hired an independent civil rights auditor to examine their practices. Jessica Thompson had become something of a minor celebrity on campus. Her computer science professors used the incident as a case study in tech ethics classes. She had already scheduled an interview with Global Tech's internship program, thanks to Sarah's recommendation. "It's not just about one security guard or one company," Jessica told her college newspaper. "It's about changing the whole culture. Ms. Mitchell showed me that you can stand up for yourself while staying professional. That's a powerful lesson." The aviation industry as a whole was feeling the effects. Other private jet companies began reviewing their own policies. The National Aviation Security Association called an emergency meeting to discuss standardizing anti-discrimination protocols across all private airports. Sarah's team at Global Tech had been busy too. They created a new initiative called Equal Skies, partnering with aviation companies to develop better security screening technology that would help eliminate bias. James Wilson had fully backed the project, allocating a significant budget for its development. "Sometimes change needs a catalyst," James told the board of directors. Sarah's experience was unfortunate, but her response has opened doors for real improvement in the industry. "We're going to help push that change forward." David Martinez, Global Tech's chief of security, was working closely with Mrs. Cooper to develop new training modules. They focused on real-world scenarios, using body camera footage and security videos to show exactly how bias could affect decision-making. "We're not just teaching people what not to do," Martinez explained during a training session. We're teaching them how to make better decisions, how to check their own biases, and how to handle situations professionally. The young black woman from the terminal wasn't the only one inspired by Sarah's composure. Business schools had already requested permission to use the incident as a case study in crisis management and leadership. They were particularly interested in how Sarah had maintained her dignity while documenting the discrimination. Sarah's calendar was now filled with speaking requests, but she remained focused on her tech work. She knew that the best way to create change was to excel in her field while opening doors for others. She had already implemented a mentorship program at Globaltech, specifically aimed at supporting women of color in tech leadership roles. As she prepared for another day of meetings in San Francisco, Sarah received a message from Mrs. Cooper. First day of new security training complete. Your experience is helping us build something better. Thank you for your strength that day. Sarah smiled, thinking about how a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement for change. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful response to ignorance was simply to stand your ground with dignity and let the truth speak for itself. 1 month after the incident, Sarah stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a special congressional hearing on discrimination in transportation. The room was packed with lawmakers, industry leaders, and civil rights activists. Camera flashes lit up the room as she began to speak. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures, Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. Sometimes it comes from simply standing your ground with dignity when someone tries to tell you that you don't belong. In the audience, Jessica Thompson sat next to Mrs. Cooper, both invited as key witnesses. Jessica was now 2 weeks into her summer internship at Globaltech, where she was already impressing her supervisors with her technical skills and leadership potential. The private aviation company had undergone massive changes. They had hired their first black woman as CEO, a former airline executive named Dr. Patricia Williams. Mrs. Cooper had built a new security training program that was being adopted by airports across the country. What happened to Ms. Mitchell was a wake-up call for our entire industry, Dr. Williams testified. But more importantly, her response showed us a better way forward. We're not just changing rules on paper, we're changing the culture of aviation security. The changes were already showing results. The company had implemented new security protocols that required all passengers to be treated equally, with clear documentation of each screening. Security officers now wore body cameras, and regular audits checked for any signs of discriminatory behavior. Back at Globaltech, Sarah's Equal Skies initiative had grown beyond its original scope. The technology they developed wasn't just for aviation. Other transportation sectors were interested in using it to prevent bias in security screening. James Wilson had made it a flagship project for the company. Sarah turned a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for innovation, James told a tech magazine. That's what real leadership looks like. She didn't just complain about the problem, she built a solution. Richard Barnes had tried to do damage control through media appearances, but his attempts to justify his actions only strengthened the movement for change. His interviews became training material for what not to do in security positions. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about privilege and access. Other industries began examining their own security practices. Luxury hotels, exclusive clubs, and high-end retailers started reviewing their protocols for unconscious bias. Jessica's video had become part of corporate training programs nationwide. Business schools used it to teach crisis management and leadership. But more importantly, it had given people the courage to speak up about their own experiences. Ms. Mitchell showed us that you don't have to choose between standing up for yourself and staying professional, Jessica said in a college forum. You can do both. That's the lesson that changed my life. Sarah had received offers to write a book, appear in documentaries, and even have her story made into a movie. But she remained focused on creating lasting change through action rather than words. Her mentorship program at Globaltech had expanded to include partnerships with tech companies across the country. Young women of color in tech now had a powerful network of support and opportunities. Mrs. Cooper's security training program had become the industry standard. She regularly traveled to different airports, helping them implement the new protocols. The changes weren't just about rules, they were about creating a new culture of respect and professionalism. What Sarah did that day was give us a masterclass in handling discrimination, Mrs. Cooper told a security conference. But what she's done since then is even more important. She's shown us how to turn a negative moment into positive change. The congressional hearing would lead to new legislation requiring anti-bias training for all transportation security personnel. But Sarah knew that real change happened in daily interactions, in the moments when people chose to stand up for what was right. As she finished her testimony, Sarah looked at Jessica in the audience and saw the future she was fighting for, a world where talent and character mattered more than appearance, where dignity and determination could overcome discrimination. The biggest change, Sarah concluded her speech, comes when we refuse to let others define who we are or where we belong. That's not just my story, it's our story, and we're still writing it together. 1 year after the incident, Sarah Mitchell stood in the newly renovated terminal of the private aviation company. The space looked different now, more welcoming, more diverse, and notably, with a large plaque on the wall that read, "The Mitchell Protocol, ensuring equal treatment in aviation security." The terminal buzzed with activity as people gathered for the 1-year anniversary event. Jessica Thompson, now a full-time software engineer at GlobalTech, stood beside Sarah. She had grown from a nervous student into a confident professional, wearing her own GlobalTech badge with pride. "I can't believe it's been a year," Jessica said, looking around at the diverse group of security officers, many of whom had been hired under Mrs. Cooper's new leadership. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." The changes were everywhere. The security checkpoint now had clear, standardized procedures displayed on digital screens. Body cameras were standard equipment, and a diverse team of officers worked together efficiently. The old atmosphere of intimidation had been replaced by one of professional respect. Dr. Patricia Williams, the aviation company's CEO, approached Sarah with a warm smile. "Your stance that day didn't just change our company," she said. "It changed the entire industry. We've had 0 reported incidents of discriminatory screening since implementing the Mitchell Protocol." The protocol, now adopted by over 200 airports worldwide, was simple but effective. Standardized screening procedures, recorded interactions, regular bias training, and diverse hiring practices. What had started as one woman's stand against discrimination had become a global standard for aviation security. Mrs. Cooper, now the National Director of Aviation Security Training, was demonstrating the new screening technology developed by GlobalTech's Equal Skies initiative. The system used artificial intelligence to ensure consistent security checks while eliminating human bias. "The technology is impressive," a reporter commented, watching the demonstration, "but the real change was in people's attitudes." Sarah nodded, remembering the countless emails and messages she received over the past year. Stories of other professionals who had faced similar discrimination, but now felt empowered to stand up for themselves with dignity. James Wilson, who had flown in for the anniversary event, shared some surprising statistics. "Since implementing these changes, our security efficiency has actually improved by 40%. It turns out, removing bias doesn't just make things fairer, it makes some work better." The event wasn't just about celebrating changes in aviation. Representatives from other industries, hotels, restaurants, retail stores, were there to learn from the Mitchell Protocol. They all wanted to know how to create similar transformations in their own sectors. Richard Barnes's story had taken an unexpected turn. After months of reflection, he had become an advocate for change, speaking at security training sessions about his own journey of recognizing and overcoming bias. His honest acknowledgement of his mistakes had become a powerful teaching tool. Jessica's viral video had been viewed over 50 million times and was now part of civil rights education in schools. But more importantly, it had inspired a new generation of young people to document and challenge discrimination wherever they found it. Sarah's mentorship program had grown into a national network, supporting hundreds of women of color in tech and aviation. Many of them were present at the anniversary event, each with their own success stories to share. "The real victory," Sarah told the gathered crowd, "isn't just in changing rules or procedures. It's in changing hearts and minds. It's in showing that standing up for yourself with dignity can inspire others to do the same." As she finished speaking, a young black girl in the audience raised her hand. "Ms. Mitchell, what should we do if something like this happens to us?" Sarah smiled, remembering her own mother's advice years ago. "Stay calm, know your worth, and let your dignity be your strength. Document everything, but never let anyone's ignorance dim your light. And remember, you're not just standing up for yourself, You're standing up for everyone who comes after you. The applause that followed wasn't just for Sarah's words. It was for everything they represented. The Mitchell Protocol had become more than just a security procedure. It was a symbol of how one person's dignity and determination could transform an entire industry. As the event concluded, Sarah and Jessica walked through the terminal together. They passed the spot where, a year ago, discrimination had tried to block their paths. Now it was a place where diversity was celebrated and respect was the standard. Sometimes, Sarah said, watching a diverse group of passengers being screened with professional courtesy, the best response to discrimination isn't anger or fear. It's standing your ground with such dignity that you change the ground you're standing on.